on. Blake.
Thank you, Chair.
Stephenson,
thank you, Chair.
I found the NAO report very troubling, and I just want to explain why. I spent 15 years in financial services before I came into Parliament, and I think had a financial services firm received this report from their auditor, that financial services firm would need to report that to the FCA, and that firm would be dragged over the coals and more likely than not would be fined. So my opening question is to ask each of you, DEFRA and the regulators, are you at risk of holding those that you regulate to higher standards than you yourself can achieve, given the deficiencies throughout this report? Maybe we'll start with DEFRA.
Well, we do hold ourselves to very high standards. We don't always achieve those very high standards, and I think what the NAO report is telling us is there's more to do. I don't think we should shy away from that. Nor, though, do I think we are a completely broken system. As I mentioned earlier, when I look at the NAO report from covering very similar territory from a couple of years ago, I can see that we've moved on substantially from where we were then. We're never going to be complacent. We're always going to need to do more. I think the NAO report we have in front of us is fair and reasonable and challenging, and that is right. As I say, we hold ourselves to high standards. But, as a relative newcomer coming into DEFRA and able to, with a fresh pair of eyes, yes, I can see lots of areas we need to do better, and, we've been setting some of those out. I also see across the group, 30,000 hard-working, dedicated, talented staff who are doing some brilliant work, both centrally and across the country.
Thank you. Environment Agency, Philip?
So we're an unusual organisation. We're a regulator, but we also maintain more than 500,000 flood assets around the country. And so when I talk to a chief executive of a water company or a waste company, I do understand the pressures they're under in terms of whole life cycle management of their assets, what it's like in the supply chain, the challenges they face. And we're very careful not to, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and we listen hard to our partners, and we understand what those businesses feel about our regulation, and we try and build that good relationship with them at all times. And at the same point, we're also mindful of our own environmental impact as an organisation. We're about to publish a revised strategy for reducing our environmental impact. This is things like using low carbon concrete, moving away from steel rebar, trying to cut our emissions if we can, and also make sure we fully comply with our obligations to support nature, particularly in the water environment. A big issue for us right now is eel management and some of the fishery issues that we face because we work in watercourses quite a lot. So I think everyone in the EA is very nervous about the risks that you point out, and we are mindful of it as we do our work, and hopefully we do not hold people to higher standards than we hold ourselves.
Thank you. Natural England, Marion?
So the high standard I hold myself and Natural England to account for is, are we doing everything we can to maximise nature recovery? So that's my benchmark, and as I said earlier, the reason we believe that matters so much is because of what society needs from nature, which continues to change and evolve as we see the impact of climate change, different public expectations and so on. So I think there is some frustration within, you might hear it in my voice, from the question that we were asked earlier. Sometimes the regulatory framework, the system in which we operate, doesn't maximise the impacts for our nature, and neither does it help with economic development and help our customers. So that's where my frustration comes in. That's why I hold myself to account. And I think there's two ways we're looking to tackle that. One is the focus of this report. Are we doing enough to think about our role as a regulator within a wider system? Are we working with our colleagues in local government, our colleagues in other regulators? I think there's also a theme you've heard from Paul several times, which I would echo very hard. Are we thinking about the outcome, not the process? And do our staff feel empowered to feel more as partners to those we develop, more collaborators? And it doesn't always feel like that. It doesn't feel like that for my staff, and I know it doesn't always feel like that for my customers. So that's a big focus for our change. I think the other theme I will touch on again is we are also using a number of other tools. Regulation is not Natural England's first lever. Even in the regulatory spectrum, I rely on the one that the NAO have also set out. We tend to be much more involved in the advice and support rather than the hard enforcement and legal action role. But even then, a lot of the outcomes we want to achieve requires us to also use advice and engagement, partnering with businesses and financial incentives to sort of focus on those big nature goals.
I think we're agreed that significant improvement is required. Paul, could you walk us through, please, your view on what a good strategic approach to regulation ought to be? You're new into the role, you've been looking at this with a fresh pair of eyes. Where do you want to get to and when?
So I think I would point to sort of 3 areas of work which I think are key to good regulation. So the first is around strategic outcomes. Again, this comes through from all the reports, we've talked about it. Is DEFRA and the DEFRA system sufficiently clear what success looks like in all of the areas of our work? And I would say we are in some, particularly if you look at the December publication of the Environmental Improvement Plan, very, very clear on what we're trying to achieve in certain areas. I think we haven't yet set out with as much clarity as we need to in some of the other areas. The farming roadmap later this year, for example, will hopefully provide clarity on those areas. I think there's then this question of, and Marian's alluded to this, are we asking regulators to operate within a suboptimal legislative framework, in essence? And as I mentioned earlier, we have a rolling programme of evaluating through post-implementation reviews and other reviews which bits of our regulatory framework are working and which are not or need revising. We then have primary legislation changes, secondary legislation changes and guidance changes, which are an important part. Maybe we come on to guidance changes, but it's a key recommendation from Dan Corrie's work is the importance of identifying the most used guidance and revising those. We've identified the top 10 most used pieces of guidance. We've already revised 5 of those. We should be out consulting on revised habitats regulation assessment guidance later this spring. And then the third area is around the culture of the regulators themselves. That gets you into how clear we are as a Department of State in our expectations on DEFRA regulators. We are hoping very shortly to issue both the Environment Agency and Natural England with a strategic policy statement. That's a new document, non-statutory, but setting out really clearly this is what we expect you to do, and indeed this is how we expect you to do it, including the concept of constrained discretion, which comes through from Dan Corrie's review and John Cunliffe's review. So that sort of sets out new approaches on risk and risk management. We do need to undertake more innovative regulatory approaches. So we've just had a good conversation about the Nature Restoration Fund. I mean, biodiversity net gain was actually a really interesting international innovation. So we need to make sure that we are driving those kind of innovations through the system. We've got a particular programme of work around planning and infrastructure changes, which is where very often this challenge around economic growth and environmental regulations plays out. There's more we need to do on joint working. We touched very briefly on the lead environmental regulator. That's appropriate for large projects. It's not necessarily going to be appropriate for all the projects, but we need to find areas where our regulatory system is joining up much more. Mr. Lowe pointed out earlier that the number of different regulators that you will come into contact with as a farmer, we need those regulators joining up in a more singular way. And then we also need the front-end service, the customer-facing services, to be as slick and smart and digitally enabled as we possibly can. Again, I think we've made some progress on that, but there's much more to do. So it's a very broad range of things, but I tend to think about it in those 3 areas. Be clear on your outcomes, set up your legislation and regulatory framework in the right way, and drive the right culture through your regulators.
My final question, if I may, Chair. There's an awful lot going on, and what you've described is quite ambitious, given where you are at the moment. How are we going to hold you to account? At what point are you going to be happy that you've delivered those things? But I think more crucially, how are you going to sort of get off the starting line? So you're in this reactive mode. How are you going to get out of the reactive gear into the strategic gear, given everything that's going on, in order for you to even just get going with all of those ambitions?
So on your question about when am I going to be happy, I know clearly the answer to that. Never. It is my job to never be happy and constantly listening to customers, to developers, to constantly be pressing for further change. When are we going to get out the starting blocks? We got out the starting blocks many months ago. So, I mean, as I say, we've come a long way over the last couple of years. I'm not coming into this new job thinking this is year 0, it all starts now. There's a huge amount that has gone on. The work that I was describing, setting out some of the new strategic intent around the Water White Paper or the EIP, this is months and months of work that is coming to fruition now. So we are shifting into exactly that more strategic approach. There are definitely things we need to tick off. I mean, I think we started with 149 recommendations, and we need to be constantly going through how many of those have we actually moved through. We've already moved through quite a lot of them. But I wouldn't want to leave the impression that we're in the starting blocks. I think we were out of the starting blocks a while ago, but equally I don't want to give you the impression that we're ever going to come here into this committee and say the job's done, nothing to see here, there's no way we can get better, and I'd be amazed if the NAO ever wrote a report that allowed us to say that with credibility.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Chair.
For us to keep calling you back for permanent secretary to see how you're getting on.